Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal. With each passing day, Sasha felt an ever-deepening sense of unease and disorientation, the kind of creeping anxiety that burrowed its way into her every waking thought. It wasn't just the inexplicable incidents happening around her daughter that unsettled her, it was the growing clarity of a gut instinct she could no longer ignore. She was beginning to believe that Jen Sidwell, the seemingly polished and influential financier who had once made her feel secure with a lucrative $250,000 deal, was the sinister force lurking in the shadows. That suspicion had been a whisper in her subconscious for weeks, but after Daisy was mysteriously placed in the wrong crib at the hospital, Sasha's fear escalated into a quiet terror. What had at first seemed like a clerical error now seemed orchestrated, deliberate, and menacing. The next signs came quickly, too quickly to be ignored. Someone had triggered Daisy's phone in her nursery without explanation. Someone had been outside the Quartermain mansion, watching, lurking in the shadows. Most disturbingly, Sasha found Daisy facing the wrong direction in her crib, dressed in a different onesie than the one she herself had put on her daughter only hours earlier. These weren't coincidences. These were signals. Signals that someone had breached their space, violated the sanctity of their home, and done so with eerie precision. Sasha couldn't shake the truth she tried to repress. Daisy, as the granddaughter of Sonny, was more than just a child, she was a symbol, a pawn in the high-stakes wars waged silently behind closed doors in Port Charles. Sasha had once hoped she could keep Daisy away from that world, tucked away safely in her innocence. But that illusion shattered the moment Christina was assaulted in a brutal, targeted attack at Charlie's pub. The message was clear: anyone connected to Sonny was no longer safe. And if Sidwell had anything to do with Christina's attack, then there was no question in Sasha's mind, Daisy was next. What made it worse was Sasha's growing awareness that the financial agreement she had entered with Sidwell was not what it seemed. What she had once seen as a generous opportunity to rebuild her life was now revealing itself to be something much darker. The money wasn't a gift. It was a leash, a carefully disguised mechanism of control. What if that deal had been nothing more than a calculated move by Sidwell to position himself closer to Daisy, not as an investor, but as a predator? She had opened up to Cody, desperate to find clarity, but no amount of friendly reassurance could cut through the dread taking root in her chest. There was only one person she knew would act without hesitation, who wouldn't be paralyzed by bureaucracy or burdened by public perception. Jason. She had once kept him at arm's length, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame for the choices she'd made. But now, as she stood on the precipice of losing everything that mattered, Jason was the only name that made sense. When Sasha came to him, frazzled and on the verge of collapse, Jason didn't bombard her with questions. He didn't demand evidence or explanations. He simply nodded and moved. His silence was more comforting than any hollow promise. With his years of experience navigating the dangers of Port Charles's underbelly, Jason recognized the pattern quickly. The disturbances weren't random, they were calculated, testing vulnerabilities. He embedded himself quietly into Sasha's daily life, not as a guardian but as a shadow, tracking every anomaly, studying delivery logs, and poring over the Quartermain estate's security systems with meticulous focus. One by one, the threads began to connect, and at the center of the web, Sidwell's name hovered like a poisonous brand. Then the night came when fear became reality. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that mirrored Sasha's internal chaos. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked the sky apart like a warning. Sasha jolted awake, a mother's instinct thrumming in her chest. Something was wrong. She rushed toward Daisy's room, only to find the door jammed, locked from the outside. Panic seized her lungs as she banged against the frame, calling for help. Then came the sound, Daisy crying, not from her crib, but from outside. She ran to the back entrance, heart hammering wildly, only to be stopped by a sight that nearly sent her to her knees. A masked man, clutching Daisy, was hurrying toward a waiting vehicle at the edge of the estate grounds. Before she could scream, Jason was already there. He had seen it unfold through the security footage moments before, and with all the force of a father protecting his own, he threw himself into the storm, sprinting through the mud and rain. He tackled the man mid-stride, the two of them crashing to the ground. Daisy fell into the wet grass, crying in terror. Jason was merciless, disarming the attacker in seconds, pinning him down with trained precision until the police arrived. Sasha, paralyzed and soaked through, could only watch as Jason emerged from the darkness, Daisy in his arms, rainwater streaming down his face, his jaw clenched in silent fury. The man was identified within hours. He had once been employed under Sidwell's Shell Corporation during a real estate development project. But what was found on his confiscated phone chilled Sasha to her core. Dozens of photos of Daisy sleeping, playing, crying, images taken without permission, clearly from inside her home. Messages were traced back to a hidden email account directly linked to one of Sidwell's offshore banking proxies. The digital trail was undeniable. With the full weight of evidence bearing down on him, Sidwell was summoned. Gone was the arrogant man in designer suits and smug smiles. Under the cold stare of Jason and the unwavering attention of the Port Charles PD, he cracked. Perhaps he thought his financial influence would protect him, or perhaps he had never imagined Jason would involve himself so directly. Either way, he confessed. He admitted to orchestrating the surveillance, claiming it was merely an investment security measure. An excuse that infuriated Jason. No investment justified terrorizing a mother and threatening a child. Sidwell had not just overstepped, he had declared war. Sasha, meanwhile, collapsed into herself, not with weakness, but with the overwhelming weight of having nearly lost her child. Her gratitude to Jason was inexpressible. In the aftermath, she didn't hesitate, she cut ties with Sidwell, dissolved the financial agreement, forfeited every cent. Money was meaningless now. Safety, trust, and peace were priceless, and Jason had given her all three when no one else could. She had doubted him once, but now she saw him for what he truly was, not just a protector, but the only line of defense between Daisy and the chaos looming outside their fragile world. And as Sasha held Daisy close, watching Jason stand at the doorway like an unmovable sentinel, she knew that from this moment forward, no threat would go unanswered, not while Jason was still standing. Sasha, still trembling from the shock and the surge of adrenaline that had only just begun to subside, stood frozen in the foyer of the Quartermain mansion as Jason stepped through the doorway, cradling Daisy gently against his chest. Rain was still dripping from his shoulders, and Daisy clung to him, her tiny hands wrapped tightly around his shirt, her tear-streaked face buried in his shoulder. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, fragile, sacred, unspoken. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. There were no words large enough to contain the flood of emotion that surged through her. Gratitude, guilt, awe, and overwhelming relief collided inside her chest as she reached out, almost afraid that this vision of Jason, so calm, so steady, so present, might disappear like a fading mirage. In his eyes, she saw no triumph, no pride, no expectation of thanks. Only quiet resolve. That was what undid her. The weight of her own misjudgments bore down heavily on her shoulders. All the times she had doubted him, all the walls she had built to keep him at a distance, suddenly crumbled. She had believed she could shield Daisy on her own, that she could manage every threat, every danger, every risk through strategy and caution and solitude. But standing in front of her, soaked to the bone and holding the very heartbeat of her existence, was the one man who had never needed an invitation to do what was right. Jason had come not because someone begged him, not because it was his duty, but because he knew he was needed. Without fanfare. Without expectation. Without hesitation. Her lips trembled as she tried to form a thank you, but her voice failed her. She didn't need to say it, not really. Jason saw it in her eyes. The unspoken apology for not trusting him sooner, the acknowledgement of all the misguided assumptions she had made. He saw the weight of her guilt, her pain, her desperation, and he did what he had always done. He carried it. Silently. Steadily. unflinchingly. Jason had never needed anyone to believe in him to act. As Daisy's godfather, he didn't see his role as ceremonial or symbolic. He saw it as a solemn vow. A promise that transcended bloodlines and politics and old wounds. Whether the danger came from underworld crime families, corporate manipulation, or political power games, Jason never flinched. He never measured risk when it came to those he loved. And for Sasha, the terrifying ordeal that had just passed was proof of that in its most raw and undeniable form. In the days that followed, as the truth about Sidwell's actions came into clearer focus, Sasha acted with a clarity that surprised even herself. She terminated the $250,000 financial agreement without a second thought. What once seemed like a lifeline, an opportunity to rebuild her career and reclaim her dignity, now felt like a poisoned gift, wrapped in gold but soaked in deception. There was no monetary value that could be placed on Daisy's safety, no transaction that could justify compromising the sacred space of their lives. Sidwell had dangled wealth as a lure, but it was Jason who had offered protection without price, loyalty without leverage. The threats, of course, had not entirely vanished. Sasha knew that. Men like Sidwell rarely disappeared quietly. His pride had been wounded, his secrets exposed, his plans dismantled. She feared he would return, maybe not in the same form, but through more subtle, insidious means. He would strike again when they least expected it, with a colder strategy and fewer mistakes. That was the nature of power-hungry men. They didn't forgive. They adapted. But this time, Sasha was no longer paralyzed by fear. She wasn't alone anymore. Jason was there, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet aftermath, where the echoes of trauma still lingered in the walls and in Daisy's restless sleep. He stayed close, never imposing, never overtaking, simply present in a way that made Sasha feel safe for the first time in what felt like years. In the mornings, she would sometimes find him sitting near the nursery, half asleep in a chair, Daisy's baby monitor resting in his hand like a silent vow. At night, when the shadows pressed too heavily on her chest, he would be the steady silhouette in the hallway, watching, waiting, ensuring that the darkness never stepped over the threshold again. Sasha began to rebuild, not just her life, but her belief in something greater than fear. She learned to trust again, not blindly, but with intention. She learned to share the burden, to allow someone else to help carry the weight. Jason never tried to take over, never once demanded gratitude or obedience. He simply stood beside her like a fortress, unwavering and still. And in that stillness, Sasha found strength. Looking back on that rain-soaked night, the night she almost lost her child, Sasha no longer saw it as the end of something, but the beginning. The beginning of a truth she had denied for too long. That courage did not mean standing alone. That strength did not mean silence. That love, real love, came not in declarations, but in sacrifice, in presence, in unwavering action. Jason had shown her that. Now, every time Daisy laughed, every time she slept peacefully through the night, every time she reached out and touched Jason's face with wide, trusting eyes, Sasha was reminded of the night he stepped through the storm and into their lives not as a savior, not as a hero, but as something even more rare, a man who kept his promises even when no one was watching. A guardian who didn't need permission to love. A protector who didn't wait for gratitude to fight. Jason had not only saved Daisy. He had saved Sasha too. And in the quiet, in the stillness between heartbeats, she knew that nothing, not Sidwell, not fear, not the past, would ever be stronger than the bond they now shared. There had been many things Sasha feared over the years, relapse, loss, loneliness, but none quite as paralyzing as the fear that someone would harm her daughter and that no one would believe her. She had spent so long trying to prove she was stable, capable, in control, that the mere thought of expressing a gut feeling without hard evidence made her feel like she might be dismissed, or worse, pitted. Her concern about Sidwell had started as a whisper, a flicker of unease that slowly evolved into a storm. But what terrified her more than the idea that Sidwell might be dangerous was the possibility that Jason, the one person she instinctively trusted to protect them, might not believe her. Because Jason had always been someone grounded in logic, strategy, and evidence, someone who didn't leap into battle without knowing the terrain. Sasha wasn't sure that her fear, grounded more in instinct than proof, would be enough. But what she didn't fully understand until that night. Until the rain was pouring, the wind was howling, and Jason stood at her doorstep with Daisy in his arms, was that Jason didn't need her to justify fear. He didn't require reports, screenshots, or legal paperwork to spring into action. He didn't see her worry as weakness or her suspicion as hysteria. What he heard was something else, the tremble in her voice, the urgency beneath her words, the maternal panic she could no longer mask. That was the only evidence he needed. Jason was many things. A soldier, an enforcer, a man of few words, but above all, he was a protector. And when Sasha told him she thought her daughter was in danger, he didn't question her motives or challenge her assumptions. He didn't minimize her concern or tell her to wait until they had more to go on. He simply acted. Quietly. Decisively. Unapologetically. Because to Jason, protecting a child never required a debate. There was no court of law, no public opinion, no internal hesitation to weigh, only action. In the days that followed, as the pieces fell into place and the ugly truth began to surface, Sasha came to realize just how right she had been, and just how wrong she had been to fear Jason's disbelief. The man who had once seemed like a distant figure in the margins of her life had become the one person willing to walk through the fire without needing a reason. Thanks to his relentless vigilance, the man behind the surveillance and attempted abduction was exposed. A man deeply embedded within one of Sidwell's real estate subsidiaries, a man whose phone contained dozens of illegal photographs of Daisy, along with encrypted communications tied to Sidwell's private offshore accounts. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a fluke, or some rogue employee acting alone. This was a system, an organized network of control, manipulation, and predation that had been carefully constructed behind the facade of a business partnership. The financial agreement Sasha had signed, a $250,000 deal that once seemed like a beacon of hope, was now tainted beyond redemption. It hadn't been a gesture of goodwill. It had been bait. A transactional leash designed to keep Sasha within reach, compliant and trusting, while Sidwell tightened his grip behind the scenes. For the public, Sidwell had long been regarded as a calculated businessman, influential and polished, known for taking bold risks and landing lucrative ventures. But now the mask had cracked. Beneath the designer suits and persuasive charm was a man who had used his wealth to manipulate, surveil, and endanger a child. Thanks to Jason, the illusion had shattered. Sidwell was no longer a respected investor, he was a predator, fully exposed under the glaring light of truth. But more than the legal consequences, what Jason had truly dismantled was the emotional prison Sasha hadn't even realized she was living in. He hadn't just saved Daisy. He had freed Sasha from the lingering shadow of self-doubt that had haunted her for years. In exposing Sidwell's corruption, Jason gave Sasha the confidence to reclaim her own voice. She didn't hesitate. She canceled the deal. She returned every dollar. She severed every tie. She no longer needed a financial safety net built on manipulation. She had something stronger now, truth, clarity, and the unwavering presence of someone who had shown her what real protection looked like. The fallout was far from over. Sasha knew that men like Sidwell rarely faded into obscurity without a fight. There would likely be legal maneuvering, counterattacks in the media, perhaps even quiet threats in the months to come. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Because now, every time she looked at Daisy, safe, giggling, reaching for her favorite stuffed animal, Sasha knew exactly who had made that peace possible. Jason hadn't just shielded them from danger. He had stepped into the darkest part of their story and rewritten it. What struck Sasha most was the way Jason never once demanded recognition for what he'd done. He didn't linger after the rescue. He didn't wait to be thanked. He simply stayed close, quietly watching from the sidelines, making sure the shadows didn't creep back in. There was no celebration, no headlines, no parades. Just the quiet resolve of a man who had done what needed to be done, then disappeared into the silence he wore like armor. And in that silence, Sasha saw something profound, something deeper than heroism or bravery. She saw compassion. Empathy. Purpose. Jason didn't protect people because it made him feel powerful. He did it because somewhere deep in his soul, he believed no one should suffer alone. And that belief made him more than a protector. It made him essential. To Daisy. To Sasha. To every person in Port Charles who had ever felt helpless in the face of darkness. Now, when Sasha woke up in the middle of the night and tiptoed into Daisy's room, watching her chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, she didn't just feel relief. She felt gratitude so profound it ached. Not just for her daughter's safety, but for the man who had made it possible. The man who had believed her when she was too afraid to believe herself. The man who didn't wait to be asked. The man who didn't need proof. The man who acted, always, out of love. For Sasha, Jason had become more than Daisy's godfather. He had become a fixed star in her orbit, a light that cut through the fog of fear and doubt, guiding her back to a place of strength and clarity. He didn't ask to be trusted. He earned it. And now, in the quiet sanctuary of their rebuilt lives, Sasha understood something she had never truly grasped until now: Jason wasn't just someone you called in crisis. He was the reason you survived it. And with him at her side, she finally believed that no matter how dark the world became, there would always be someone standing between her and the storm.